The first time Grace Dawson turned a stranger away hungry was the day she decided she never would again, even if it meant going to bed with nothing but water in her own stomach. That decision had been made 3 years ago, in the summer of 1882, when a boy no older than 14 had come to her door with hollow eyes and cracked lips, and she had told him she had nothing to give because she was afraid. She had watched him walk away down the long, red dirt road that stretched out from her small homestead toward the town of Colburn, Kansas, and something inside her had broken quietly, like a dry branch underfoot. She never saw that boy again. She did not know his name. She carried him with her every single day after that. So when the riders came through, and they always came through in Colburn, which sat on the edge of the old cattle trail routes, and drew every sort of drifter, ranch hand, and desperate soul that the West produced, Grace fed them. She fed them from her garden when her garden was producing. She fed them from her root cellar when the garden was bare. She fed them from the last of her flour and her last smoked side of pork when the root cellar ran low. And when she had none of those things, she made corn porridge from the dried ears she kept hung along the rafters for exactly such occasions, and she served it with whatever wild herbs she could find growing near the creek, and she served it with dignity and without complaint. Her homestead was modest. 160 acres of Kansas prairie that her late husband, Thomas Dawson, had claimed under the Homestead Act of 1862, and had broken his back to work before a fever took him in the winter of 1879. Thomas had been a good man and a decent farmer, and he had left Grace with the land, a small whitewashed house, a barn that leaned slightly to the east as though considering lying down, a milk cow named Pearl, and a debt to the grain merchant in Colburn that she had been slowly, stubbornly paying down one season at a time. She was 26 years old. She had brown hair that she kept braided back tight, gray eyes that caught light in a way that made people feel she was paying very close attention to them, which she always was, and hands that were rougher than any woman's hands she had ever seen in the fashion plates that sometimes made their way out from back east. She did not mind her rough hands. They were the hands that kept her land and kept her promise. The riders who came to her door were all manner of men. Cowboys heading north with trail herds, drifters looking for seasonal work at the big ranches that spread out east of Colburn, a Mexican vaquero once, who spoke almost no English but removed his hat with great dignity before accepting the bowl she offered. A group of 3 exodusters, black families who had come west from Mississippi looking for the promise the land held, and whom the town of Colburn had received with cold suspicion. Grace had fed all of them. 2 of those families had eventually settled on land north of her property, and she counted their matriarch, a woman named Hattie Monroe, among the closest friends she had ever known. She did not think of herself as generous. She thought of herself as a woman who had made a promise to a memory of a hungry boy, and she intended to keep it. The morning Emmett Chandler rode up her road was the 3rd week of October in 1885, and it was already cold in the way that Kansas October cold was different from any other cold, thin and sharp and relentless, pushing down from the north without apology. Grace was out by the garden, pulling the last of the parsnips before the ground froze solid, when she heard hooves on the road. She straightened and looked. The man coming was riding a bay horse that moved with the particular careful deliberateness of an animal that had been ridden a very long way and knew it. The rider himself sat straight in the saddle the way men did when they were too tired to allow themselves to slouch, holding themselves up by sheer will. He had a brown canvas coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather and a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a bedroll behind the saddle, which told her he was traveling alone and had been sleeping outside. He stopped at the gate of her fence and touched the brim of his hat. He looked at her for a moment with eyes that were dark brown and careful, the eyes of a man accustomed to reading situations before he stepped into them. "Morning, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and a little rough, the way voices got when they had not been used much in the last few days. "I was wondering if you might know of any work in this area, seasonal or otherwise. I am good with cattle and horses, and I know carpentry to a fair degree." Grace looked at him. She looked at the horse, and at the set of his jaw, and at the way his left hand rested slightly away from the sidearm he wore, making a deliberate point of not touching it, which she appreciated. "Are you hungry?" she said. He paused. There was a quality to that pause that she recognized. It was the pause of a man who had been taught that pride required a specific answer, but whose body was insisting on a different one. "I could eat," he said, which was not the same as yes, but was as close as a man like him was likely to get. "Tie your horse to the post," she said. "Come inside." She went ahead of him into the house, and he tied the horse and followed, removing his hat when he stepped through the door and holding it in both hands the way respectful men did. She put the cast iron pan on the stove and cut thick slices from the bread she had baked 2 days ago and put them to warm, and she sliced the last of a cured ham that had been hanging in her cellar since summer, and she fried eggs from her 4 remaining hens, and she put coffee on because she had a small amount of coffee left, and this seemed like a morning that warranted using some of it. He sat at her table and did not speak while she cooked, but he was not awkwardly silent. He was the kind of silent that came from someone who was comfortable with quiet, which she found she liked immediately. She set the plate in front of him and the coffee beside it and sat down across the table with a cup of her own, and she watched him say a quiet grace before he ate, so quietly she almost missed it, just a brief still moment with his eyes down. Then he ate. He ate steadily and without the frantic gulping of a man who had not eaten in days, which told her he had eaten something recent, though not much. He was hungry but not desperate, and there was a distinction. "Emmett Chandler," he said, when he had taken the edge off the hunger and could speak more comfortably. "From Abilene, originally. I have been working the Texas herds the last 3 years, but the drives north are winding down. The railheads are moving and the trail business is not what it was." She knew that. Everyone in Colburn knew that. The cattle trails that had once made towns like Abilene and Dodge City boom were drying up as the railroads pushed further south and the ranchers shipped from closer points. The cowboys who had made their living on the long drives north were having to find other ways to make themselves useful. "Grace Dawson," she said. "My husband filed this claim. He passed 6 years ago. I have been running it alone since." She said it plainly because it was a plain fact, and she had learned that saying it directly saved a great deal of awkward circling around the truth later. Something moved in his expression. Not pity, which she would have disliked. Something more like respect, the kind that came from recognizing something one understood. "That is a considerable undertaking," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He finished his breakfast and asked if he could water his horse at her well, and she said of course, and he went and did that and came back and stood in the doorway holding his hat again, and she could see him working up to something. "I meant what I said about the carpentry," he said. "I can see your barn wants some attention. I noticed the lean on it coming in. I could look at it if you would let me, as payment for the meal." Grace looked at him for a moment. She thought about her barn, which had been leaning since the spring and which worried her considerably because it housed Pearl and her 2 horses and the hay she needed to get through winter. "I do not need payment for a meal," she said, "but I could use someone who knows what they are doing with that barn. The thing is, I do not have wages to offer until spring, if then." He nodded. He was not surprised. "Is there a bunkhouse or somewhere I could sleep out of the cold? I can find work at the other ranches during the days, but evenings I could put in on that barn and whatever else needs doing." She studied him with those careful gray eyes for a long moment. He met her gaze steadily and without pushiness, just looking back at her honestly. "There is a room in the barn," she said finally. "Small, has a cot. It stays warm enough with the animals." "That would suit me fine," he said. So that was how Emmett Chandler came to be at the Dawson homestead in October of 1885. And if either of them had known then what that arrangement would grow into, They might have gone about it with a great deal more ceremony. He found work the next day at the Harding Ranch 3 miles east, doing the kind of heavy autumn work that ranches always needed going into winter, mending fences, moving cattle to winter pasture, splitting firewood. He was good at all of it, and Harding paid him fair, $2 a day, which Emmett accepted without haggling and worked every hour of to earn. He came back to the Dawson place each evening just before full dark, and Grace always had something on the stove because she always had something on the stove. She cooked the way some people breathed, continuously and without thinking about it as a separate act, and she always made enough for two without making any announcement about it, and he always came and sat at her table and ate, and they talked. The talking was perhaps the thing that surprised them both most. Grace had been largely alone for 6 years. She had Hattie Monroe to the north, and she had the acquaintances in town, and she had the riders who came and went and took a meal and moved on. But she had not had anyone who stayed and talked, who was interested in her opinions about things, who pushed back on what she said and made her think harder about it. Emmett asked her about the land, about what she grew and why, about her rotation of crops and her management of the soil, and he listened to her answers the way a man listened when he was genuinely interested in learning something and not just being polite. She found herself going into more detail than she had with anyone in years, explaining her reasoning about when to plant and when to let a field rest, about the way the creek flooded in spring and how she used that rather than fighting it. He told her about the trail drives, about the long weeks of moving cattle north through country that shifted from Texas scrub to Indian Territory to Kansas grassland, about the particular loneliness of being one of 8 men responsible for 2,000 animals in open country, about the way the sky on the plains at night was something that could either make a man feel very small and frightened or very free, depending on the man and depending on the night. Which did it make you? She asked one evening, not looking up from her mending. He thought about it for a long moment. The lamp was low and the stove was putting out good heat, and outside the wind was doing what Kansas wind did in October, which was to say it was doing everything it could think of. Both, he said, sometimes on the same night. She looked up then. He was looking at the table, not at her, and there was something in his face that she would not have known what to call exactly, only that it was honest. "I think that is the right answer," she said, and went back to her mending. His work on the barn was methodical and careful. He assessed it first, spending a full evening walking around it and inside it, and looking at the joints and the post bases and the foundation stones, testing the wood with a knife blade and a hammer, making notes on a piece of paper in handwriting that was better than she expected. Then he told her what was wrong, which was that 2 of the main posts had rotted at the base, and the whole weight of the north side was leaning because of it, and what was needed, which was new post lumber and hardware, and 2 full days of work. She had some lumber left over from the previous spring when she had tried to enlarge her garden shed. He assessed it and said it would serve, and named the hardware he needed, which she could get in town. She went to Colburn the next Saturday morning, and Emmett went with her. Colburn in 1885 was a town of approximately 400 people with a main street that had a grain merchant, a dry goods store, a livery, a saloon called the Blue Bottle, a small hotel, a church, a school, and the office of the county land agent where Grace had spent too many uncomfortable afternoons over the years discussing her debt. It was also a town with the particular social texture of small western towns, which meant everyone knew most things about everyone else's business and had opinions about it. Grace had come to town alone for 6 years. Coming in now with a man riding beside her generated exactly the kind of observation and comment she had anticipated, which was to say, she felt the attention like a weather change before anyone spoke a word. Martha Fielding, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Harold, managed to convey an entire essay of meaning in the single look she gave the 2 of them when they came through the door, a look that moved from Grace to Emmett and back to Grace, and contained in it questions, assessments, approvals, warnings, and gossip information, all without a single syllable. Grace introduced Emmett as a hired hand she had taken on for the season, which was accurate and also technically not the complete picture. But she was not in the habit of explaining herself to Martha Fielding. Emmett picked up the hardware they needed and paid for it himself, which she had not expected, and which created a small internal argument in her between the part of her that wanted to insist on paying her own way and the part of her that recognized a gesture of goodwill when she saw one. "You did not have to do that," she said when they came out of the store. "I know it," he said, loading the hardware into the back of her wagon with a quiet efficiency. "I wanted to." She looked at him over the side of the wagon. He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes and the faint expression that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "Thank you," she said, and meant it fully. They were halfway back to the homestead when a rider came up behind them fast and pulled alongside, and Grace saw immediately from the set of his horse and the recklessness of his approach that this was trouble of some kind. The man was young, mid-20s, red-faced from drink or anger or both, and she recognized him as Roy Purvis, the younger son of the Purvis family who had land to the south and a long-standing bad habit of making things difficult for their neighbors. Roy Purvis pulled his horse alongside Grace's wagon and said, loudly enough that it was meant as performance, "Grace Dawson, I heard you have taken in some drifter. My father wants you to know that a woman alone out there would do better thinking about who she is associating with." Grace kept her eyes on the road and her hands steady on the reins. "Thank you for the concern, Roy," she said. "Now I will ask you to move away from my wagon." Roy looked at Emmett, doing the sizing up that young men who expected to be feared always did with new men. "I am talking to Mrs. Dawson." "I heard you," Emmett said. His voice had not changed in temperature or volume. He was looking at the road ahead, not at Roy, which was its own kind of message. "And she has asked you to move off. I would do that." There was a moment. Roy Purvis was working out whether this was a fight he wanted, and Emmett was giving him every possible opportunity not to choose it, and Grace was sitting very still and feeling something she did not immediately identify, which was the feeling of not being alone in a confrontation, of having someone beside her who was not looking to make things worse, but was also absolutely not going to let things slide past a certain point. Roy Purvis moved off. He rode ahead without another word, which was a small retreat dressed up as casual indifference, but it was a retreat. Emmett did not say anything about it. He did not comment on how he had handled it, or what he thought of Roy Purvis, or what Grace should think about any of it. He just sat beside her on the wagon seat, and they rode on through the cold October afternoon, and eventually they began talking again about the barn, and about what needed doing before the first heavy freeze. She thought about that for a long time that night, lying in her bed listening to the wind. She thought about the quality of a man who could diffuse something without making a show of it, who could stand beside a woman without standing in front of her. He fixed the barn over 2 evenings and a Sunday, and he did it well. He replaced both bad posts and releveled the frame and added bracing she had not thought to ask for, and when he was done, the barn stood straight and solid, and looked as though it intended to remain that way for a considerable time. Hattie Monroe came by the following week with her daughter Mee, and a pie she said was sweet potato, which was Hattie's way of delivering information along with food. She appraised Emmett with the particular directness that Hattie brought to everything, asked him 3 questions about his background that were designed to reveal character rather than biography, and then apparently decided something favorable, because she invited both Grace and Emmett to Sunday supper the following week, and did not wait for much of a response before accepting it on their behalf. After she left, Emmett stood in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and looked after her departing wagon with an expression Grace could not entirely read. "She is something," he said. "She is everything," Grace said. "She and her family came west in 1879 with almost nothing." They have built more with less than anyone I know. The town has not always been kind to them." He was quiet for a moment. I saw that coming through, the way the man at the livery spoke to her husband when we were in town. "Yes," Grace said, "there is a great deal that is not right about how things are for people like Hattie's family out here. It does not get said enough." He turned and looked at her. "You say it." "I say what I can," she said. "It does not always change much." "It changes something," he said. "It always changes something." November came in with a cold that had teeth to it, and the work shifted from outdoor repair to indoor preparation. Grace spent her days processing the last of the fall stores, smoking meat, putting up the dried beans and parsnips and carrots, rendering lard, baking the hard bread that kept well through winter. The work was relentless, and she did it the way she did everything, with complete attention and without complaint. But there were days when the sheer weight of doing all of it alone year after year, pressed down on her in a way that she had never allowed to become self-pity but could not entirely ignore either. Emmett was still working at Harding Ranch through the week, but he had taken to helping with the evening chores at the Dawson place, feeding the animals, carrying water, splitting wood, doing it without being asked and without making a thing of it, just doing what needed doing the way a person did when they were genuinely invested in a place. One evening Grace came into the barn to find he had not only fed Pearl and the horses, but had repaired the latch on Pearl's stall that had been loose since spring, and had restacked the entire hay supply more efficiently, with better access to the older bales she needed to use first. She stood looking at it for a moment. He was at the back of the barn cleaning his tack, and he looked up. "The old latch was about to give," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been meaning to fix it for months." "There is a lot that one person cannot get to," he said. He said it simply, without judgment, just as an observation of fact. "Yes," she said, "there is." She stood in the doorway for another moment, looking at the restacked hay, and she was aware of a complicated feeling that was partly gratitude and partly something more uncomfortable, the particular discomfort of letting someone in, of having someone see the places where you had been falling short because you simply could not do everything at once. "Emmett," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You do not have to call me ma'am. We have been sharing a table for 6 weeks. He looked up again. That faint, not-quite smile was there. "Grace," he said, and the sound of it in his voice, just her name, simple and direct, did something unexpected to her composure that she was glad the low barn light concealed. Hattie Monroe's Sunday supper was the kind of event that Hattie organized the way she organized everything, with enormous competence and a specific strategic intention. She seated Emmett and Grace beside each other, which surprised neither of them and required no comment. She served a meal that was far better than anything the season strictly allowed for, and she had invited 4 other families as well: the Kellermans, who were German immigrants with a farm to the northeast; the Abbotts, who had come from Ohio the previous year; and old Sam Whitfield, who had been homesteading this country since 1870, and who knew everything about the land and its history, and was generous with that knowledge when he was treated with respect. The evening was warm and noisy, and full of the particular richness of people who had made lives in a hard place, and gathered together to remind themselves why it was worth it. Emmett fit into it with a naturalness that Grace noticed carefully. He listened to Sam Whitfield's stories with genuine interest and asked the right follow-up questions. He helped without being asked when Hattie's husband Jerome was struggling to move a bench. He made Hattie's daughter Me laugh with a dry observation about the difference between Kansas weather and Texas weather that even Me's usually wary husband found funny. On the ride home in the wagon under a sky full of cold stars, Grace said, "They liked you." "Good people," he said. "Genuinely good." "The best I know," she said. They rode for a while. The horses moved steadily through the dark, finding the road by long habit. "Can I ask you something?" Emmett said. "You can." "Why do you do it, the feeding everyone who comes through? I have seen 3 different riders in the weeks I have been here. Each one you fed before you asked anything about them. I am asking because I notice it, not because I think it is wrong." She considered it. It was not a question she was asked often. People generally either took the feeding as simply what one did, or they found it peculiar and said so in ways that were more criticism than question. "I turned someone away once," she said. "A boy. He was hungry and I was afraid, and I said I had nothing to give, which was not entirely true. I never knew what happened to him. I think about him more than you would think is reasonable." He was quiet for a moment. "I think it is entirely reasonable," he said. "I decided that I would rather go hungry myself than turn someone away," she said. "It sounds more noble than it is. It is really just that I could not live easily with the alternative." He turned and looked at her in the starlight. The cold had brought color to his face, and the stars were very bright, and she could see him clearly. The steadiness of him, the way he looked at her like someone who was genuinely seeing her and not just looking at her. "I think it sounds exactly as noble as it is," he said. She looked away at the road ahead, but she was smiling. The first real snow of winter came in the second week of November, which was early even for Kansas. A heavy wet snow that came down through the night and left the world silent and white and beautiful and very cold. Grace was up before light doing the chores, breaking the ice on the water trough, carrying hay to Pearl, bringing the chickens extra grain. She came back inside cold to her bones and found that Emmett had built up the fire and had coffee hot and was making a reasonable attempt at corn porridge on the stove. "You do not have to cook," she said, pulling off her coat. "I can manage porridge," he said. "Sit down." She sat. She was tired. She had been up in the night twice because she thought she heard something in the barn and had gone out and found nothing. Only the animals shifting in their sleep and the sound of snow on the roof. But going back to sleep after that was always difficult, and she had not slept well. He set the porridge in front of her and sat across from her with his own and the coffee between them, and they ate while the fire cracked and the snow pressed against the windows, and it was the most comfortable Grace had felt inside her own house in years. She was aware of it, that comfort, and aware of what it meant or might mean, and she was not entirely sure what to do with the awareness. "You should know," she said, looking at her porridge, "that I do not have wages to pay you, not now. I have a debt to the grain merchant in town that takes most of what I make from the summer harvest. What is left goes to seed for next year. I am not in a position to offer you what you deserve for the work you have put in here." He looked at her steadily. "I have not been thinking about wages. You should be. It is your living. I have my earnings from Harding. They will take me through winter." He paused. "I like it here, Grace. I like this work and I like this place. I am not keeping score." She looked at him then. "That is a kind thing to say." "I mean it," he said. "Which makes it easier to say." In the weeks that followed, something between them shifted with a slowness that was also an inevitability. The way weather moved across the Kansas plains, visible from a long way off, changing everything it touched. They fell into the rhythms of the place together. She knew how he took his coffee, and he knew which chores she preferred to do herself and which ones she was glad to share. She knew that he went quiet when he was thinking hard about something, and that the best thing was to let him and not push. And he knew that she expressed worry as briskness, and that when she was sharpest in her manner, it usually meant she was afraid of something. They knew these things about each other in the bone-deep way you came to know someone you lived and worked beside through the kind of days that stripped away pretense. There were evenings when they sat by the fire after supper, she with her mending or her accounts, and he with whatever repair or project he had taken up. And they talked or did not talk, and it was both kinds of comfortable. The comfortable of conversation and the comfortable of silence, and both were equally real. One evening in late November he told her about the war. He had not brought it up before, and she had not asked. He told her that he had been 17 in 1865 when it ended, too young to have served but old enough to have seen what came back from it in the men who returned to Abilene, what was missing from them, and what had been put in its place that was not good. He told her that his father had not come back, and that his mother had held their small spread together with a grim tenacity for 3 years before her health gave out, and that he had been 19 with nothing but the land when she died, and had not known what to do with grief or land both at once. So he had sold the land and taken his grief on the road, and had been moving more or less ever since. "Do you ever wish you had kept the land?" she asked. He was quiet for a long while. The fire was low and the room was the particular peaceful dim of late evening. "I used to," he said. "I think what I wished was that things had been different so I would not have needed to make that choice. Now I am not sure. I think I had to go before I could be ready to stay somewhere." She heard what was underneath that. She did not point to it, but she heard it, and she thought he knew she did. The Purvis family made their presence known again in early December, when Grace came home from town to find that the fence along the south edge of her property had been cut in 3 places. It could have been an animal, except that wire did not come apart at fence post intervals by accident. She stood looking at it in the gray, cold afternoon light with her jaw set and her eyes quiet and angry. Emmett came up beside her and looked at it too. He said nothing for a moment. "The Purvis land is south," he said. "Yes. Have they done things like this before?" "They have made suggestions that I should consider selling," she said. "Twice through Roy and once through the father himself. My land sits between theirs and the creek access they want." Emmett looked at the cut fence for another moment. "I will restring this today," he said. "And we should go see the county sheriff tomorrow." She looked at him. "Jack Harmon has known Wade Purvis for 20 years. He is not going to leap to action over a cut fence." "Maybe not," Emmett said, "but we put it on record, and then if it happens again there is a record." She had not thought of that. She had been thinking of it as a confrontation, either accept it or fight it, not as a process of building evidence over time. The practical calmness of his approach diffused some of the anger and replaced it with something more useful. "You are right," she said. They restrung the fence together, working in the cold with their breath making small clouds, and she found that working alongside him in something like this, something that was about protecting what was hers, felt entirely different from working alone. Not because she could not do it alone. She had been doing it alone for 6 years. But because there was a difference between being capable of being alone and choosing to be alone, and she had begun, slowly and without having planned for it, to understand that difference in a new way. They went to Sheriff Harmon the next morning. He received them with the careful neutrality of a man who was aware of his political situation and wrote down what Grace told him with the tone of a man going through a required motion. But he wrote it down, which was what Emmett had said mattered. On the way home, Grace said, "You have dealt with things like this before. Men who use their neighbor's vulnerability as an opportunity," he said. "Yes, too often." "Did it resolve?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes." When the neighbor had someone watching their back and the man doing the pressuring knew it, he paused. Cowards generally are responsive to evidence that their calculation was wrong. She looked at the road ahead. "You think Wade Purvis is a coward?" "I think he chose a widowed woman farming alone as his target," Emmett said. "I think that tells you something about his actual nature." December deepened and hardened, and the homestead pulled in on itself the way all living things did in hard Kansas winter. Grace's stores were adequate, she had been careful, but they were not generous. She fed the riders who still came through, fewer of them now because sensible men were not riding the open prairie in December if they had any choice, but they still came sometimes, and she still fed them. A pair of brothers headed west to try their luck in Colorado mining country. A former buffalo hunter who had lost that work when the herds were finally gone and was heading somewhere uncertain, carrying his grief over the changed country in the set of his shoulders. Emmett watched her with each of them. He saw how she was with them, the particular way she made each person feel that the meal was offered freely and fully and without grudging, so that they could take it without the aftertaste of obligation. He saw how she never made it about what she was giving, but always about the simple fact of a table and a warm room and food on it. One evening after a rider had left, a young man who had eaten 2 full plates and thanked her 3 times and said something about his mother that made his voice catch, Emmett sat across from Grace and looked at her for a long moment while she cleared the plates. "I have been thinking about something," he said. She looked at him across the table, a stack of plates in her hands. "I would like to stay here," he said. "Not just through winter, beyond that. I want to work this land with you. I want to be part of it." He paused. "I am asking if that is something you would want too." The room was very quiet. Grace put the plates down carefully on the table because it seemed like the sort of moment that required careful movements. "That is a considerable thing to ask," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practice at keeping her voice steady. "Yes," he said, "I know it is. I would not ask it if I was not certain." "And what does certain look like to you?" she said. "After 2 months," he looked at her directly. "It looks like knowing that the place I want to be is wherever you are. It looks like having known that for some time and having tried to be sure it was real and not just the warmth of a good house in winter." He paused. "I am sure." Grace looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, reading him the way she read everything, carefully and completely, not looking for reasons to doubt but also not willing to pretend the doubt was not there. Because there were questions that came with this kind of thing. Questions about whether a man who had been moving for 16 years could truly stop, whether the barn room and the shared table could bear the weight of what they were building toward, whether she could let herself need someone again after learning how quickly you could lose them. She asked him the things she needed to ask. "Thomas died, and I had to hold everything together alone. I was not angry at him for dying. But I know what it is to be left alone. I need to know that you understand what you are asking me to consider." He did not look away. "I understand it. I am not going to pretend I can promise you nothing will ever go wrong, but I can tell you that I am here because I want to be here. I am not passing through. I was passing through and this is where I stopped. That is different." "It is different," she said. She sat down across from him. She looked at the lamp and at her hands on the table, and at the man across from her, who had fixed her barn and fed her animals and stood beside her with the Purvis trouble, and had sat with her 6 nights out of 7 for 2 months, quiet and steady and real. "Yes," she said, "it is something I would want." The expression that moved across his face then was not triumphant. It was something gentler than that, something relieved, something that said he had been less certain of her answer than he had tried to sound, and that honesty of it, the visibility of his own vulnerability, was the final thing. "Good," he said. And then, because there was still the question of what exactly they were agreeing to, what the shape of it was, he said, "I would like to do this properly. I would like to ask you to marry me when you are ready for that." "Ask me in the spring," she said, "when winter is over and you have seen the whole year of this place." "Fair," he said. They sat at the table for a while longer in the lamplight, and neither of them said very much more, because there are moments in a life that do not improve with a great deal of talking. Christmas came, and with it a cold that was brutal even by Kansas standards, the temperature dropping to the kind of degree where the wood for the fire never quite got ahead of it, and the water in the pitcher by the window was iced by morning. Grace gave extra hay to the animals twice a day, and carried warm water from the stove to keep them from having to break ice on their own. Pearl the milk cow was producing less than usual, and Grace supplemented Pearl's feed with extra grain from her stored reserves, which depleted them faster than she would have liked. Hattie Monroe came by on Christmas Eve with her husband Jerome and their children, bearing a smoked venison haunch and a jar of preserved peaches that were so extraordinary in the depths of winter that Grace nearly laughed out loud when she saw them. They ate together in the small, warm house, all 7 of them crowded around the table that was designed for 4, and it was one of the best evenings Grace could remember in years. Jerome Monroe and Emmett discovered a shared passion for woodworking and spent a portion of the evening in earnest discussion about joints and saw angles, while Hattie caught Grace's eye across the table and made a face that communicated very clearly what she thought about the direction of things, a face that combined satisfaction, warmth, and a complete told-you-so without a single word. After the Monroes left and the dishes were done and the fire was built up for the night, Emmett gave Grace a gift. It was a carved wooden box, small enough to fit in both hands, made from the same oak wood as some of the spare lumber in the barn. He had carved a vine and flower pattern along the lid that was delicate and precise, and clearly took a great deal of time and skill. Inside the box was a small mirror, not a fancy one, just a plain tin mirror such as you could find in any dry goods store, but set into the box's lid he had fitted it perfectly, a little vanity mirror that folded down when the box was closed. She held it in both hands for a long moment. She looked up at him. "I made the box," he said. "The mirror I bought in town. It is beautiful," she said, and meant it completely. It was one of the most carefully made things she had owned, and it told her something about how he spent his evenings and what he had been thinking about when he spent them that way. "Merry Christmas, Grace," he said. She gave him the gift she had made for him, which was a heavy wool vest she had been knitting from unraveled blanket wool in the evenings when he was in the barn, or when she thought he was occupied enough not to notice. It was warm and well-fitted because she was a good judge of measurements and a careful knitter, and she had lined the inside with soft flannel. He put it on immediately, and the look on his face was something she tucked away to keep. January was hard. January in Kansas was always hard, but this one was worse than most, with a series of blue northers that came through one after another without enough recovery time between them. The cold damaged Grace's root cellar door despite their efforts to insulate it, and she lost a portion of her carrot and beet stores to freezing before they could repair the door. It meant that the last months of winter would be tighter than she had planned. She did not stop feeding the riders who came through. There were fewer of them, hardy or desperate men who were traveling in weather most wouldn't, but when they came she fed them. She cut her own portions back and made the food go further, and she did not discuss it with anyone as a sacrifice because it was not a sacrifice in her mind. It was simply what was necessary to keep her promise to herself and to the boy she had turned away 3 years ago. Emmett noticed, of course. He noticed everything about this place, everything about her. He said nothing for several days, and then one evening when she set a particularly spare supper on the table, he set down his fork and looked at her. "The stores are getting low," he said. "They will hold," she said. "Grace, they will hold, Emmett." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have some savings, not a great deal, but enough to go to town and restock what we lost from the cellar. I cannot take your savings." "You are not taking them. I am spending them on something I have an interest in." She looked at him. "This place," he said. "I have an interest in this place, in what happens here. You said yes to what I asked you. That makes your stores my stores, or it should." She looked at him for a long time. "Not yet it doesn't," she said. "Not formally." "Formally," he said, with a slight edge that was not quite frustration but was close to it. "Is there something wrong with what I am offering?" "No," she said. "There is nothing wrong with it. I just need to be careful about what I depend on." He understood then. She could see him understand it. He sat back and his face shifted from the edge of frustration to something more careful. "You have been let to depend on yourself for a long time," he said. "Yes. And you need to know that what you might depend on me for is real and will stay real." "Yes," she said. He nodded. He did not push further. But the next Saturday he went to town and came back with flour and dried beans and salt pork, and he put them in the cellar without comment, and she accepted it without comment, and they both understood that something had moved between them that was not a small thing. The riders continued to come even in February, which surprised her. Word had apparently traveled, as word did in the West, the informal network of communication that moved along roads and campfires, and the word-of-mouth of men who spent their lives in motion. She did not know how it traveled, only that a man who came to her door one bitter February morning said he had heard from a rider in Colburn that there was a woman on this road who fed people, no questions asked. She fed him. He was a young Texan heading north looking for work, 20 years old and polite in the way of someone raised carefully, who said grace over his meal and thanked her twice and asked if he could chop some wood before he left, which she let him do. Emmett came out of the barn while the young man was chopping, and they worked side by side for a while. two men working in the cold, and she watched from the window with her hands around her coffee cup and thought about the texture of this life she was building and found it was precisely the texture she wanted. The Purvis trouble came back in February with more seriousness. Roy Purvis came to her door on a Tuesday afternoon when Emmett was at Harding Ranch, and he did not come in the manner of a neighbor coming to talk. He came in the manner of a man who had been told to deliver a message and had worked himself into something to be able to deliver it. He stood at her door with his hat on, which she noticed as a deliberate rudeness, and told her that his father was making a final offer on her south acreage, $2 an acre for 40 acres, which was below market, and both of them knew it, and that it would be in her interest to consider it carefully. "Tell your father thank you for the offer," Grace said, standing in her doorway with absolute calmness. "I'm not selling any of my land." "You are in debt," Roy said. "Everyone knows it. A woman alone cannot hold this place long-term." "I am not alone," she said, "and I will thank you to move off my property." Something shifted in Roy's expression. "The hired man," he said. "Emmett Chandler," she said. "My intended," and yes, she had not planned to say that. It was out of her mouth before she had thought it through, but once it was there, she found she did not want to take it back. She meant it. She had meant it since December, had simply not said it aloud in terms that were that final. Roy Purvis left. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching him go, and then she went inside and sat down at her table and felt the weight of what she had said, and decided that it felt correct. When Emmett came home that evening, she was at the stove and she told him what had happened, including the precise words she had used, without looking at him until she had finished. Then she turned and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, and there was something on his face that was very still and very warm at once. "You told him you were my intended," he said. "I did. You told me to ask you in the spring." "I know I did." She folded her hands together. "I am telling you now that when you ask me in the spring, the answer will be yes. I thought you ought to know that clearly." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands in his, and held them, and looked at her with those steady dark eyes that she had come to know as well as she knew anything in the world. "Grace Dawson," he said quietly and directly, "will you marry me?" "It is not spring," she said. "No," he said, "it is not, but I am asking anyway." The warmth in her chest was enormous and calm at once, the way the best kind of certain things felt. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Emmett Chandler." He brought her hands up and pressed them to his lips, both of them together, and it was not a showy gesture. It was the gesture of a man who was holding something he had wanted for a long time and knew its worth. They were married in April of 1886, when the grass was coming back and the fields were warming, and the world was making good on its annual promise to continue. The ceremony was performed by the preacher at Colburn's church, a practical man named Reverend Aldous, who had done hundreds of frontier marriages, and brought to each one a simple dignity that Grace appreciated. Hattie Monroe stood with Grace and Jerome stood with Emmett, and the church was half full with people from Colburn and the surrounding homesteads, including the Kellermans and the Abbotts and old Sam Whitfield, and several of the other farm families Grace had come to know over her years there. She wore her best dress, which was the deep blue wool she had made 2 winters ago, and she had pinned a small cluster of early prairie wildflowers at her collar that Mee Monroe had found for her that morning. Emmett wore a clean dark coat that she suspected had been purchased specifically for the occasion, and he stood at the front of the church with a quality about him that she could not have described to anyone who was not looking at him directly, which was simply that he looked like a man in exactly the right place doing exactly the right thing. When Reverend Aldous asked if she would take this man, Grace said yes with the same calm certainty with which she approached everything she was sure of, which was the best kind of certainty there was. They were married in the eyes of the law and of God and of everyone who mattered, and when they walked back out of that church into the April morning with the sun on the greening grass and the sound of Hattie Monroe laughing at something Jerome said, it felt to Grace like the ground was solidly and permanently under her feet, in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. The celebration that followed was at the Dawson homestead, because Hattie Monroe had taken the matter in hand and organized a gathering that drew 40 people, more than Grace had known would come, and which involved more food than Grace had thought logistically possible given the season, achieved through collective contribution, each family bringing something, which was how the best frontier gatherings worked. Grace and Emmett stood together in the yard of their homestead as the light went golden in the late afternoon, and people filled the space around them, and children ran between the adults, and someone had brought a fiddle and was playing in the corner by the barn, and Grace let herself feel it fully. She let herself feel the improbability of it, and the richness of it, and the way something could be hard and good at the same time, which was in her experience the way most worthwhile things were. The summer that followed was the best summer Grace could remember on the homestead. They worked it together, and the difference between working something alone and working it with someone who was as invested as you were was impossible to overstate. The planting went faster, and the planting was better planned, because Emmett brought knowledge about crop rotation and soil management from seasons at different ranches and farms that complemented what Grace knew from her own years. And together, they decided to put in more winter wheat that fall, which would give them a staple crop that was more reliable through hard winters. Emmett renegotiated the debt with the grain merchant in Colburn, going in with the books Grace had kept carefully for 6 years, and making the case that the debt was manageable, and the land was productive, and the terms should be adjusted, and coming out with a revised repayment schedule that was genuinely workable and not simply barely endurable. Grace had not known this was possible. She had simply been enduring the terms because enduring was what she knew how to do. Emmett walked into that office knowing it was a negotiation, not a judgment, and that made all the difference. The Purvis trouble resolved itself not through confrontation but through consequence. Wade Purvis overextended himself that summer buying cattle on credit at a price that did not pan out, and by fall he was selling land rather than buying it, and Roy Purvis left for New Mexico because there was nothing left to stay for. The south fence stayed intact. Grace stood at it one September morning and looked south toward what had been Purvis land and was now simply land under a different ownership. A man from Ohio who had come west with his wife and seemed to be trying to be a decent neighbor, and she felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a trouble that had simply run out of energy without requiring a war. The writers kept coming. The reputation had spread in that way things spread on the frontier, along the roads and in the saloons and around the campfires, that there was a woman on the road outside Colburn who would feed you if you were hungry, no questions, no debt, no judgment. Grace did not think of it as a reputation. She thought of it as simply what they did. Emmett never questioned it. He sat with the writers when there was time, asked them where they were from and where they were headed, and occasionally Grace would find him outside with some man who had come through, helping to look at a lame horse or repair a broken piece of tack before they went on their way. He extended the welcome the same way she did, as a simple natural fact of the place. One afternoon in August, a family came through that was different from the usual lone riders. A woman about Grace's age named Clara, with 2 small children and a wagon, and a husband who had broken his arm 3 weeks ago and had it set badly by someone without enough knowledge, so that it was healing wrong and causing him enormous pain. They had been heading for Colorado and were now stopped by the fact that the husband, a quiet man named Peter Elliott, could not properly drive the wagon. Grace and Emmett looked at each other over supper that evening, and then Emmett went out the next morning and drove to Colburn and came back with the doctor, a young man named Fielding who was new to the county and more skilled than his predecessor. Dr. Fielding reset Peter Elliott's arm, which was an unpleasant procedure that Peter Elliott bore with admirable stoicism while his wife held his hand, and the 2 children sat wide-eyed and silent in the corner. The Elliots stayed for 2 weeks while Peter healed enough to drive. It was not a hardship. Clara Elliott was useful and eager to help, and she and Grace worked together in a productive harmony that Grace found she had missed without knowing it, the company of another woman working alongside her. The two children, a boy of 6 named James and a girl of 4 named Lucy, were gentle and curious, and followed Emmett around the farm with an attachment that he accepted with a patient good humor that Grace watched carefully and warmly. When the Elliots finally left for Colorado, Peter Elliott shook Emmett's hand for a long time, and Clara Elliott embraced Grace in the kind of embrace that comes from genuine feeling rather than formality. "God bless this place," Clara said. Grace watched their wagon go down the road until it was out of sight. By autumn of 1886, the homestead had changed in visible ways. The barn was fully sound now, with additional repairs Emmett had done over the summer that addressed several other concerns beyond the original post-issue. There was a new chicken coop, better designed than the previous one, and with real protection against foxes and coyotes. The garden was larger and better organized, and the winter stores were fuller than they had been in any of the years Grace had been holding the place alone. Emmett had also built a proper root cellar door, insulated and weatherproofed, which would not fail them the way the previous one had in January. He had done this methodically over the course of 3 weeks, thinking it through carefully and doing it well, and the finished door was solid, and Grace ran her hand over the wood and the weather strip, and felt something that was simply profound satisfaction at the competence of a well-made thing. The grain debt was down by 1/3. The winter wheat was planted. Pearl the milk cow had a calf, a male they named Henry, who would be ready to sell by spring, which would bring in cash money at a time when they could use it for seed stock. They lay in the evenings in the warmth of the house they had made into something fuller and more inhabited than it had been, and Grace thought about the years she had been in this place alone, and did not feel regret about them because they had made her who she was, but could not entirely imagine going back to them. "Are you happy?" Emmett asked her one evening, not with any anxiety in it, just as a genuine inquiry. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said, "I am happy. I did not know if I would be again." "I am glad you are," he said. He was lying with his arm around her, and she could feel the steadiness of his breathing. "I want you to know that what you do here, what this place is, it is not a small thing. The people who come through and eat at this table, they remember it. It is the kind of thing that stays with a person." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the boy again, the boy she had turned away, who had made her who she was in that particular regard. She thought about all of the people who had sat at her table since then. The vaquero who had removed his hat, Hattie and her family, the Exodusters. The Texan who had chopped her wood, the Elliots. "I hope it stays with them," she said. "I hope it is useful to someone." "It is useful to everyone," he said. "I know it is useful to me." She turned and looked at him. "You did not need it in the way they did." "Did I not?" he said. And she thought about the man who had come down her road on a worn-out bay horse in October, holding himself upright through sheer will, and decided that he was right. He had needed it too, simply in a way that was not only about the meal. November of 1886 brought news that made both of them stand still and hold each other's gaze for a long moment. Grace was expecting. She had known for a few weeks and had held it close, checking and rechecking it against how she felt, because she was not a woman given to announcing things before she was sure of them. When she was sure, she told Emmett in the kitchen after supper, simply and directly, and watched his face go through something that was not easily described because it was too many things at once, a kind of overwhelming careful joy that he worked to hold steadily because he was worried about how she felt and did not want to assume. "Are you well?" he said. "I am well," she said. "Better than well." He came around the table and put his arms around her with a gentleness that had in it everything she had ever needed from him, the strength and the care, both present and real. Hattie Monroe was told the following Sunday, and responded with a shout of pure delight that made Jerome and the children come running from the other room to see what had happened. And then there was a great deal of talking all at once, and Hattie was already planning things before any of them had a chance to propose any plans, which was precisely how Hattie operated and precisely why things got done. The winter of 1887 was cold but manageable, because they were better prepared, and because Grace was healthy and strong despite the pregnancy, with the particular determined physical competence that had always been characteristic of her. She modified what she did, but she did not stop, and Emmett was watchful without being managing about it, which she appreciated more than she said. He did say once carefully, "I want you to let me carry the heavier things." "I know what I can carry," she said. "Grace, I am not made of glass, Emmett. I know you are not. You are the least glass-like person I have ever met." He paused. "I am asking you to let me help because I want to, not because I think you cannot manage." She looked at him. "That is a better way to ask it," she said. And after that they managed it the way they managed most things, through honest communication and a mutual respect for the other's competence. The riders still came. In February, a man came through who was the worse for weather and worse for drink, and in a condition that Grace had rarely seen come to her door. She fed him, and she let him sleep in the barn for 2 nights, and when he left he was steadier, and he thanked her without being able to meet her eyes, which she understood. In March, a group of 4 cowboys came through together, heading north for the spring drive to the Dakotas, which was where the cattle work was moving now that the old Kansas Trail routes were finished. They were young men, the oldest of them no more than 25, and they ate everything she put in front of them and made her laugh 3 times, which was a fair exchange. Emmett sat with them for a long time after the meal. She watched him from the kitchen as she cleaned up, watching him talk with these young men who were doing what he had done for years, and she saw in his face something that was not longing exactly but was a kind of recognition, a knowing of that life from the inside. She did not feel any uncertainty about it. She knew him. She knew that what he had was here. When the young cowboys left and their noise and energy went with them down the road, Emmett came back inside and Grace was putting the last of the dishes away, and she did not say anything, and he came and stood beside her and put his hand on her back and she leaned into it. "Good bunch," he said. "They were," she said. "Young. We were young," he said. "We are not old," she said. "No," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "We are absolutely not old." The baby came in June of 1887, which was good timing because the hardest work of planting was done, and the harvest was still weeks away, and summer was warm and generous. Hattie Monroe came to attend along with Doc Fielding, and it was a long labor but a strong one, and at the end of it, Emmett Chandler held his son for the first time with an expression on his face that Grace would carry with her for the rest of her life. They named him Thomas James Chandler. Thomas for Grace's first husband, because Thomas Dawson had been a good man, and this land was his legacy, and it was right to remember it. James because it was Emmett's father's name, and a way of honoring a man who had gone to war and not come back. Thomas James was, from his first hours in the world, a considerable person. He had dark eyes like his father and the particular steady attention that Grace recognized as her own, and he had an appetite that impressed everyone who met him, which seemed fitting given the house he had been born into. Hattie Monroe looked at the baby and then at Grace and then at Emmett and said, "Well, this is the right outcome of everything," with a satisfaction that seemed to encompass not just the baby but all of the preceding events that had led to his existence, all the way back to a cold October morning when a man had come down a road on a tired horse and been offered breakfast. The homestead continued to grow. In the 2nd year of their marriage, Emmett got a proper agreement established with Harding Ranch to supply a specific amount of winter wheat annually, which gave them a stable income that the homestead alone could not entirely provide, and which also gave Emmett a working relationship with the surrounding ranching community that was professionally solid. He was respected in the county as a capable man and a fair one, which mattered in ways both practical and social. Grace expanded her garden to a scale where she was producing surplus regularly, and she began a modest business selling preserved goods through the dry goods store in Colburn, which Martha Fielding agreed to stock with the enthusiasm of someone who had recognized a commercial opportunity, but who also genuinely liked Grace's products. The preserved goods were well made, and Grace's reputation for quality came with them, and it added a stream of income that was not large but was steady and hers. When Thomas was 2, they had a second child, a daughter named Rose Elizabeth Chandler, who arrived in early spring with considerably less drama than her brother and who had from the beginning a personality of cheerful determination that combined her parents' qualities in a ratio that was all her own. Hattie Monroe said Rose looked like trouble in the best possible way, and Grace said she thought that sounded exactly right. The debt to the grain merchant in Colburn was paid in full in the summer of 1889. Grace stood in the merchant's office, which had been an uncomfortable room to stand in for many years, and signed the final paper with a hand that did not shake, and walked out into the Colburn Main Street with the paid receipt in her hand, and stood in the sunlight for a moment just breathing. She had paid for this land. It was hers and Emmett's, free and clear, and the sky over it was the wide blue sky of the Kansas prairie that was either frightening or free depending on the man and depending on the night. And today, for her, it was entirely and completely free. She went to find Emmett, who was at the livery getting a shoe replaced on the roan horse, and she held up the receipt and he read it, and then he looked at her face, and then he did something she did not expect, which was that he sat down on the bench outside the livery right there on the main street of Colburn and put his elbows on his knees and let out a long, slow breath, and she saw in the release of it how much he had been holding. "We did it," he said. "We did," she said. She sat down beside him on the bench, and they sat there on the main street of Colburn, Kansas in the summer of 1889, with the receipt in her hand and the sun on the street and the ordinary business of the town moving around them, and it was one of the most complete moments Grace had ever known. He put his arm around her, there on the bench in front of anyone who cared to look, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, and they were quiet together for a long time. The riders kept coming through the Chandler homestead, as people had begun to call it, though Grace still thought of it as the Dawson homestead in the part of herself that honored Thomas's claim and his broken-back work. And in truth, it had enough history in it now that one name was not sufficient for all of it. The word had spread as far as the trade routes stretched, which in the West was considerable, and people who were hungry and traveling came to this place knowing they would not be turned away. There was a period in the fall of 1889 when they were feeding 3 to 5 riders a week, which put a genuine strain on the stores, and Grace and Emmett discussed it with the practical directness they brought to practical problems. They could not feed everyone if they had nothing left, and they had 2 children and a farm to maintain through winter. They decided to keep a separate store of dried corn and beans specifically for the purpose, replenished each harvest from the surplus, so that the feeding of riders never came at the direct expense of the family stores. It was a practical system that kept the promise without breaking the household, and Grace thought that Thomas Dawson would have approved of it, would have recognized in it the same kind of pragmatic decency that she had seen in him. Old Sam Whitfield came by the homestead that October, which he did every few months, and sat with them at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the country, about what it had been and what it was becoming. He was in his late 60s now, his hair fully white and his hands stiff with the years of outdoor work, but his mind was as sharp as it had always been, and his knowledge of the land they all lived on was irreplaceable. He told them about the years before homesteading, when this had been open range, and before that, Cheyenne and Comanche country, and the weight of that history was in his voice when he spoke of it, not defensiveness but acknowledgement. Grace had heard him speak of it before and had always appreciated that he did not slide past it, that he held the complexity of what they were all part of out here, the opportunity and the injustice both present in the same land. "This country owes debts it is not paying," he said. "Yes," Grace said, "it does." Emmett was quiet for a moment. He had said to her once, privately, that what he had seen on the trail drives, the displacement that the cattle industry had enabled, was something he thought about more now that he was in one place and watching the country settle around him. "I do not know what the right thing to do is," he had said, "but I think knowing what is wrong is the start of it." "You do right by what is in front of you," Sam Whitfield said, with the directness of an old man who had been working that problem for decades. "You feed the hungry, you treat people fair, you speak the truth about what you see. It is not enough, but it is not nothing." Grace thought about that for a long time after Sam left. She thought about it in the context of everything she had been doing at this table, with this road, with this door open. She did not think it was heroic. She thought it was what a person did when they had decided what mattered to them and then had tried to live that way, as consistently and as honestly as they could manage. The following spring, 1890, Emmett came inside from the field with a look on his face that made Grace put down what she was doing and pay attention. "There is a family at the gate," he said. "A large one. They have been traveling a long time. They look like they could use more than one meal." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and came to the door and looked down the road. It was a family, a man and a woman and 5 children ranging from infant to perhaps 10 years old, with a wagon that had clearly been repaired multiple times and 2 horses that were thin. They were exodusters. She could tell that from the road, black families still making the migration west that had been going on since the late 1870s, seeking the land and freedom the southern states had refused to deliver on. She went to the gate to meet them. Their name was Fuller. The father was named Absalom Fuller, and his wife was named Martha, and their 5 children had names she asked about and remembered carefully. She fed them. She fed them fully and well, and she made up the extra room for the children to sleep in, and she and Emmett gave up the barn room for Absalom and Martha, and they stayed for 4 days, while one of the horses recovered from a thrown shoe and a foot issue that needed tending. During those 4 days, Absalom Fuller told Grace and Emmett about what they had come from, about Mississippi, and about what life there had been for his family since the end of Reconstruction and the pulling back of the promises that had been made. And Grace listened to it with her full attention and her full belief, because she had no reason not to believe it, and every reason to understand that what he was describing was the truth about a country that said one thing and did another. She told him about the land north of her property, about the fact that there was an unclaimed section further north that the county agent had been trying to move and had not found a buyer for, and she offered to go with him to the county land office and make the introduction, which she knew mattered because she also knew what the county land agent's default disposition towards someone who looked like Absalom Fuller was likely to be. She went. Emmett came too. They sat in that office with Absalom Fuller and his wife Martha, and they made the introduction, and they made it clear that the Fuller family was known to them and vouched for by them. And the county agent processed the paperwork with a specific reluctance that he made visible in small ways that Grace noted and did not let pass without response, saying simply and clearly, "This family has every right that the law provides, and I would like you to process this with exactly the same care and speed you would give anyone else." He did. The Fuller family filed their claim on 40 acres north of the Monroe farm, and the following year, when they were on their land and beginning to build it, Absalom Fuller came by the Chandler homestead on his own and stood at the door and said simply, "I do not have the words for what you did." "You did not need my words," Grace said. "You needed the land. That is yours now. Build it well." He did build it well. He was a gifted farmer, meticulous and thoughtful about his land the way good farmers are, and within 3 years the Fuller farm was one of the better producing properties in the county, and the Fullers and the Monroes and the Chandlers had a relationship of mutual practical support that was one of the genuine good things in that corner of Kansas. Grace had a 3rd child in the spring of 1892, another son, whom they named Emmett James Chandler, Jr., though they called him Jamie from the first day to distinguish him from his father, and Jamie arrived with the particular noise and vigor of a child who intended to make himself known, which he did, consistently, from that point forward. Thomas was 5 by then, already following his father around the farm with serious attention, already asking questions about the soil and the livestock that revealed an intelligence that would need to be educated properly. Rose was 3 and had her mother's gray eyes and her own entirely unique personality, a combination of warmth and will that Grace recognized as something that was going to be formidable in a grown woman, and this thought filled her with a quiet satisfaction. The homestead in 1892 looked very different from the property that Thomas Dawson had filed on in 1862, and that Grace had held alone from 1879 to 1885. It was a working, producing farm with good structures and good soil management, and a reputation in the county for both quality output and the particular open-door generosity that had by now been part of it for a decade. The barn stood straight and solid. The root cellar was well made and had not failed them in any winter since Emmett built the proper door. There was a second small house on the property, started the previous fall and nearly finished, which would eventually provide room for whatever came next, whether that was family or the hired help they might someday need when the land grew to full production. Hattie Monroe's daughter Mee had married a good man from the Abbott family and was expecting her first child, and would have the Monroe homestead and the Fuller farm and the Chandler farm all within visiting distance of each other, which Hattie said was entirely as it should be, and which Grace agreed with completely. Old Sam Whitfield died in the summer of 1892 at the age of 71, which was a considerable age for a man who had spent 50 years in the Kansas frontier. He died in his own house on his own land, which was how he would have wanted it, and the funeral was attended by most of the county, which was the tribute of a community to a man who had been part of it longer than most. Grace stood at his grave and thought about what he had said about doing right by what was in front of you, and felt the truth of it. Emmett spoke at the funeral because Sam had asked him to, the previous year when Sam knew he was slowing. He spoke simply and honestly about what it meant to be given knowledge by someone who had lived in a place long and deeply, about the gift of that transmission. When he came back to stand beside Grace afterward, he was quiet, and she put her hand in his, and he held it with both of his. And they stood in the summer sun in the churchyard, and let the weight of things be what it was. The grain deal with Harding Ranch had expanded by 1893 to include a second ranch. The McAllister spread to the west, and Emmett had become the kind of man other men in the county went to for an honest opinion about land and livestock, which was a form of currency that had no paper denomination, but was real in every practical sense. He had become, in the decade since he had ridden down Grace's road on a tired horse, as rooted in this place as anyone she knew, as rooted as the grass, which was a comparison she made to him once, and that made him laugh. "Better than the grass," he said. "The grass pulls up. Not the deep roots," she said. "Not the kind that go down for years. You cannot pull those up." He looked at her with that warm steadiness that was so entirely his, the look she had first seen across her kitchen table on a cold October morning when he had said grace over his breakfast, and then eaten with the dignity of a man who had maintained his dignity through difficult circumstances. "No," he said, "you cannot pull those up." They were sitting on the porch after supper on a summer evening, 1893, and the children were inside finishing their supper under the reluctant supervision of 12-year-old Thomas, who took the responsibility seriously enough to be effective at it. And the prairie stretched out in all directions in the golden late light, and the road was visible from here, the road that ran in front of the homestead toward Colburn. As Grace looked at it, a rider appeared on the road, moving slow, a man on a gray horse with the particular gait of someone who had been traveling all day. She watched him approach. Emmett saw him too and said nothing, just watched with her. The rider slowed at the gate and stopped and looked up at the porch. He was a middle-aged man, weathered, with a tired face and careful eyes. "Evening," he said. "I am looking for a meal and a direction toward Colburn. I was told this was the place." "This is the place," Grace said, and she stood up from her chair. "Come in and tie your horse at the post. I will have something on the table shortly." The man looked at her for a moment with the expression she had seen on many faces at that gate, the expression of someone receiving something they had not been entirely sure was real, relief and gratitude, and a kind of disbelief that such a thing simply existed. "Much obliged," he said. Emmett stood too. "I will take your horse to the water trough," he said. "She looks like she has earned a drink." The man nodded, and there was nothing in his face that was anything but genuine, and he dismounted and handed over the reins and followed Grace up the porch steps and through the door into the house. And the smell of supper was on the air, and the lamp was warm, and inside the voices of children were arguing about something minor with the particular energy of children who were well fed and well loved, and everything was as it should be. Grace went to the stove and checked the pot and called to Thomas to set another place at the table, and she put bread on the board and filled the water pitcher, and moved through the kitchen with the ease of a woman in full possession of her place and her life. The rider sat at the table with his hat on his knee and looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man recognizing warmth when he was in it. The back door opened, and Emmett came in from settling the horse and went to the wash basin and cleaned his hands and came to the table and sat down. And Rose appeared from the side room and climbed into her chair with her dark braids slightly undone from the day. And Jamie came running from somewhere and was caught by his father before he could upset the water pitcher. And Thomas came from the back carrying the extra plate with the serious competence of a boy who had been taught that tasks are done properly or not at all. Grace carried the pot to the table and served, and the rider watched it all with the quietness of someone witnessing something, not just a meal but the life around a meal, the particular texture of a place where things were real. She sat down and Emmett said grace, briefly and genuinely, the same quiet grace he had said on the first morning she fed him, the same grace they said every evening at this table, and then they ate. The rider's name was Henry Cross, and he was from Missouri, and he was heading west to see about land, and he stayed for 2 hours at that table and talked with them about what the country was and what it had been, and what a man might make of 40 acres in western Kansas if he was not afraid of work. When he left he was better fed and better informed, and he turned at the gate and touched his hat to them both, standing together on the porch with the evening settling into blue and the children visible in the window behind them, and he said, "I have not been wrong about this place before." "You have not been here before," Emmett said. "No," Henry Cross said, "but I have heard about it. And everything I heard was right." He rode on down the road toward Colburn, and the light went with him, and Grace and Emmett stood on their porch and watched until the road was empty again, the way they had stood and watched so many people come and go from this place over the years. The people who passed through and were fed and went on. The people who stayed and became neighbors and friends. The people who were changed in small ways by what they found here and carried that change with them into the country, which was wide and complicated and full of injustice, and also full of this, the ordinary deep sustaining rightness of a door left open and a table set for whoever needed it. "That was a good evening," Emmett said. "Yes," Grace said. She leaned against him in the cooling air, his arm around her and her head on his shoulder, and the prairie was enormous and the stars were coming out one by one in the darkening sky. And from inside the house came the sound of children and lamplight and the life they had built together. And all of it was hers, and all of it was his, and all of it was real and solid and good, rooted down deep in the Kansas ground the way the deep grass was, the kind you could not pull up. The lamp in the window burned steady against the dark, the way it always had, the way it always would, and the road stretched on in both directions, open and ready for whoever might come next.